This is the planetary government of Meridian. We hereby declare independence from the Imperium.
The freighter drifted in absolute silence at the edge of the Hollow Expanse. Engines cold, hull lights dark, transponder broadcasting nothing but a weak, automated distress code that had been repeating on a loop for 6 days straight. And Raid Commander Ozrek Thallis knew, the moment his sensor officer brought the contact up on the display, that something about it was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the numbers. The numbers were simple enough. A Meridian-class human freighter, unarmed, unescorted, drifting powerless in contested space that no sane trader would enter without at least a fighter screen for protection. Easy salvage by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of soft target his ship had been assigned to intercept along this stretch of the Hollow Expanse for the past 3 months. What made Ozrek uneasy was not the freighter's vulnerability. It was the persistent, rhythmic pulse his sensor officer kept flagging deep within the ship's hull. A heartbeat-steady thrum of power that had no business existing on a vessel, with every other system reading stone cold. "Something's alive in there," his sensor officer said, a young Karvash technician named Vel who had not yet learned to keep the nervousness out of her voice during a hunt. "Not crew life signs, something mechanical. It's been pulsing at the same interval for as long as we've had it on sensors, once every 4.2 seconds, steady as a drumbeat." "Reactor blade," Ozrek said, though he did not entirely believe it himself. "Residual charge in a damaged core." "Maybe," Vel said, in the careful tone of a subordinate who disagreed but knew better than to say so directly. Ozrek had commanded raiding vessels for the Karvash Remnant for 11 years, long enough to trust his instincts over his own reassurances, and his instincts were telling him that a freighter this quiet, this perfectly, deliberately still, was not simply an unlucky trader caught out past its depth. It was waiting for something. He simply did not yet know what. "Bring us alongside," he said. "Boarding party, full readiness. And Vel, keep that pulse on continuous monitor. I want to know the second it changes." The boarding party cut through the freighter's primary airlock without resistance, the cutting torches making short work of a door that, Ozrek noted with growing unease, could easily have been reinforced against exactly this kind of intrusion and simply hadn't been. Whoever crewed this ship had not built it to keep raiders out. They had built it, or so it increasingly seemed, to let raiders in with as little friction as possible. The corridors beyond the airlock were dim, running on minimal emergency lighting, the air stale but breathable and utterly unnervingly empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no evidence of the panicked, hasty evacuation Ozrek would have expected from a crew abandoning a disabled freighter in hostile space. It was as though the ship had simply been left, deliberately, in exactly the conditions someone wanted it found. Frost had gathered along the seams of the bulkheads in delicate, feathered patterns, the particular signature of a vessel that had been running its life support at the barest survivable minimum for a very long time. And Ozrek noted, moving deeper into the ship, that every door they passed stood open, every storage locker unlocked. Every private compartment stripped of anything that might have suggested a crew had ever lived aboard this vessel at all beyond the single occupied chamber his boarding party had yet to reach. It felt less like boarding a captured freighter and more like walking through a building that had been carefully, deliberately prepared for a single, specific visit, every unnecessary obstacle cleared away in advance. "Commander," came a voice over the boarding party's comm channel, tight with an emotion Ozrek's second-in-command rarely allowed into his voice. "You need to see the cargo hold." Ozrek made his way through the freighter's narrow, quiet corridors himself, boots echoing against decking that had clearly been kept meticulously clean despite the ship's apparent abandonment. And when he reached the cargo hold, he understood immediately why his second had sounded the way he had. The hold was empty. Not partially empty, not stripped down to a fraction of its capacity the way a freighter running light on a return route might appear. Completely, deliberately empty, every mounting point and cargo rail bare, Every deck panel swept clean, as though the ship had never once carried anything at all in its entire operational history. Every space, that was, except for a single reinforced chamber at the hold's far end, sealed behind a vault door considerably more sophisticated than anything Ozrek would have expected to find on a civilian freighter. Humming faintly with the same steady 4.2-second pulse, his sensor officer had flagged from orbit. "No cargo," Ozrek said slowly, staring at the vault. "None at all." "None, Commander," his second confirmed. "Whatever they sent this ship out here to carry, it isn't in the hold." "Then what," Ozrek said, "is behind that door?" Before he received an answer, another member of the boarding party called out from further up the corridor, and Ozrek followed the sound to the freighter's small command bridge, where he found something that unsettled him considerably more than the empty cargo hold had. A woman sat alone at the command console, hands folded calmly in her lap, watching the boarding party enter with an expression that held none of the fear or desperate hope Ozrek had come to expect from captured crews over 11 years of raiding. She looked, if anything, faintly relieved, the particular exhausted relief of someone who had been waiting a very long time for a moment they had known with total certainty was eventually going to arrive. "Raid Commander," she said, before anyone had spoken a word to her. "You took longer to find us than I expected. I was beginning to worry we'd have to send a second distress signal." Ozrek studied her carefully, searching for the tremor of fear he was accustomed to seeing in captured prisoners and finding none. "You wanted to be found." "I wanted to be found by exactly the ship that found us," she said, "which, given your patrol assignment along this section of the Hollow Expanse, was always the most statistically likely outcome. My name is Captain Odalis Ferreira. I'd offer you my cargo manifest, but it would be a rather short conversation. There isn't one." "There's no cargo," Ozrek said. "We've already confirmed that." "There never was," Odalis said, and something in her calm, level voice carried a weight that made Ozrek's earlier unease sharpen into something closer to genuine alarm. "This freighter has never carried cargo, Raid Commander, not once in its entire service history. It was never built to." "Then what," Ozrek said, echoing the question he'd asked his second minutes earlier, "is in that vault?" Odalis looked at him for a long moment, and Ozrek had the distinct, uncomfortable sense that she was weighing something, deciding how much truth a Karvash raid commander had earned in the first 5 minutes of their acquaintance. "The truth," she said finally, "which is considerably more dangerous cargo than anything you were hoping to find, and considerably harder to sell on the black market. I'd suggest you sit down, Commander. This is going to take a while to explain, and I don't think either of us wants you making decisions about that vault before you understand what you'd actually be destroying." Ozrek did not sit down, but he did not order the vault breached either, some instinct older than 11 years of raiding telling him that whatever waited behind that reinforced door deserved considerably more caution than the average smuggled contraband. "Talk." Odalis studied him for another moment, then nodded slowly, as though he had passed some small, private test. 22 years ago, there was a research colony called Orlia's Reach, built on the edge of a Nebula 3 sectors coreward of here, on a world that human survey teams selected specifically because of unusual energy signatures detected beneath its crust. Signatures that turned out to be the remains of an underground structure considerably older than anything human archaeology had ever previously encountered. Older, in fact, than most of the currently spacefaring civilizations in this region of the galaxy, including, I suspect, your own. Ozrek felt something cold settle in his chest, an instinct sharpening toward a conclusion he did not yet want to reach. Precursor ruins. "You know the term," Odalis said, watching him carefully. "I know the stories," Ozrek said. "Every spacefaring species in this region has some version of them. Ancient builders vanished long before any of us existed, leaving behind fragments too advanced for anyone to fully understand. My people were taught the stories were myths, propaganda meant to justify certain historical decisions our leadership made regarding contested territory. They're not myths, Odile said quietly. They're considerably more real and considerably more dangerous to certain people's interests than any myth has ever been. My mentor, Dr. Ria Osai, led the excavation team at Oralia's Reach for 6 years. She was, by every account I've ever encountered, the most brilliant xenoarchaeologist of her generation, and she spent those 6 years carefully, patiently documenting a structure that appeared to be some kind of dormant transit and communication network, built by a civilization so far in the past that even the network's original purpose had become, functionally, unknowable. What happened to her? Ozrek asked, though some part of him had already begun to suspect the answer. She died, Odile said, along with the entire population of Oralia's Reach, 7,000. 312 people in what my government's official records describe as a catastrophic reactor containment failure. A tragic accident, unavoidable, nobody's fault. Her voice, still calm, carried underneath its careful control something sharp enough to cut. I was there, Raid Commander. I was 19 years old, working as Dr. Osai's junior research assistant, and I left the colony 11 hours before the reactor supposedly failed, on an evacuation shuttle that Dr. Osai personally ordered me onto over my own objections, because she said she needed someone to survive who could carry what we'd found somewhere it would actually be believed. Ozrek said nothing, watching her, understanding with growing dread exactly where this account was heading and finding himself, despite 11 years of hardened professional distance from the grief of captured prisoners, unable to look away from it. Odile's gaze drifted for a moment past him, toward some point in the middle distance that Ozrek understood had nothing to do with the freighter's bridge and everything to do with a memory she had clearly relived more times than she could count. I remember the shuttle's rear viewport, she said quietly, because I made myself watch through it the entire 11 hours, even after the crew chief told me there was nothing left to see. I remember the colony's habitat ring catching the light of the nebula just before the first strike hit, this soft violet glow along the outer hull, the kind of thing you only notice when you're already saying goodbye to it without knowing that's what you're doing. Dr. Osai's transmission cut out 14 minutes after the strike began. 14 minutes, Commander, between the moment the first ship decloaked over the ring and the moment there was nothing left broadcasting from Oralia's Reach at all. I have listened to the recording of those 14 minutes more times than I am willing to admit to you, or to anyone, because somewhere in the static and the screaming and the calm, steady sound of Dr. Osai giving evacuation orders to people who had nowhere left to evacuate to, I kept hoping I would hear something that told me it hadn't been as deliberate as it sounded. I never did. Every strike pattern was precise. Habitat ring first to prevent any further evacuation launches. Communications array second to prevent any distress signal from reaching outside the sector. The excavation site itself last, sealed under enough ordnance that even the ruins we'd spent 6 years carefully documenting were reduced to slag before the attacking fleet withdrew. That is not the signature of an accident, Commander. That is the signature of a plan, executed by people who accounted for every possible way the truth might escape, and simply failed to account for one 19-year-old research assistant with a mentor stubborn enough to put her on a shuttle against her own wishes. There was no reactor failure, Odile said. I've spent 22 years gathering proof of that, piece by careful piece, and what I've assembled points to something considerably more deliberate. Oralia's Reach was destroyed, Commander, in a single coordinated strike, by a fleet that my government's official records insist never existed in this sector during that period. A fleet whose engine signatures, preserved in fragmentary long-range sensor data that took me 19 years to track down and authenticate, match a classification your own Karvash Remnant has used for exactly this kind of deniable operation for decades. Ozrek felt the deck seem to shift beneath him, though the ship itself remained perfectly still. You're saying my people destroyed your colony. I'm saying someone destroyed my colony, using ships built to Karvash specifications, and that whoever gave that order understood exactly what Dr. Osai's excavation team had found beneath Orlaya's reach, and decided that 7,312 lives were an acceptable price to keep that discovery from reaching anyone who might act on it. Thallis held his gaze steadily. I don't believe, Commander, that your remnant's leadership acted alone. I don't even believe they necessarily understood the full scope of what they were destroying. I believe, based on 22 years of careful investigation, that someone considerably higher up the chain than either of us, someone within what your people call the Obsidian Concord's directorate, wanted that discovery buried and found your remnant a convenient, deniable instrument to bury it with. If any part of this story is landing the way it should, now's a good moment to hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me who you think really gave that order, and whether you think Ozrek is going to believe her. Because what happens next changes everything he thought he understood about the fleet he's spent 11 years serving. Ozrek stood in silence for a long moment, turning Thallis' words over with the particular deliberate care of a man who had built his entire career on following orders he'd never once thought to question, and finding, to his considerable discomfort, that he could not immediately dismiss what she was suggesting. Even if I believed you, he said finally, and I have given you no reason to think I do, you still haven't explained the vault. If your colony was destroyed 22 years ago, what exactly have you been carrying around a battle zone for the past 2 decades? Dr. Osai's final act, Thallis said, before she ordered me onto that evacuation shuttle was to upload the entirety of her research along with her own consciousness into an experimental neural preservation core her team had been developing as an unrelated side project, originally intended for long-duration deep space research applications where biological survival wasn't guaranteed. She didn't have time to explain the technical details to me before I left. She only had time to tell me that the core needed to survive, that it needed to reach somewhere with the authority and the impartiality to actually investigate what happened, and that I was the only person she trusted enough to spend however long it took making sure that happened. You're telling me there's a person in that vault, Ozrek said slowly. Not data, a person. I'm telling you there's what's left of a person, Thallis said. And for the first time since the boarding party had found her, something in her carefully composed voice cracked slightly, revealing the exhaustion of 2 decades spent carrying a grief she'd never been allowed to properly set down. 22 years of careful, patient, extraordinarily lonely work went into keeping that core functional, Commander, moving it between increasingly desperate hiding places, funding its maintenance through cargo runs and courier work, and eventually smuggling operations dangerous enough that I stopped bothering to track how many times I nearly lost everything trying to protect her. I built an entire life around getting her to somewhere she could finally testify. And every avenue I tried within my own government's official channels led to dead ends, stonewalling, and on 2 occasions, attempts on my life considerably too coordinated to have been coincidental. So you decided to let yourself be captured, Ozrek said, understanding arriving with the particular unwelcome clarity of a puzzle piece sliding into place. By us. Not by anyone, Thallis said. By you, specifically Raid Commander Ozrek Thallis, commanding a remnant patrol vessel that I have spent the past 4 months confirming operates along a route that intersects, twice monthly, with a neutral trade corridor patrolled jointly by the Concord of Free Systems Oversight Fleet. I couldn't get official investigators to take my claims seriously through diplomatic channels my own government controlled, because my own government's directorate had every incentive to make sure those channels went nowhere. But a Karvash Remnant raiding vessel, one that happens to cross paths with neutral oversight forces on a predictable schedule, gave me a route into evidence custody that nobody in my chain of command could quietly bury before it ever reached anyone impartial enough to actually investigate. Ozrek stared at her, a slow, dawning horror settling into place alongside a considerably more personal and uncomfortable recognition. You used us. You let yourself be captured specifically because you needed a vessel with no reason to protect my government's interests, carrying you directly toward the one authority that might actually listen. I did, Odalise confirmed, without a trace of apology in her voice. And I'd do it again, Commander, without hesitation, because Dr. Osai has been waiting 22 years for someone to finally hear what she has to say, and I was not willing to let that wait continue one day longer than it absolutely had to. The vault door, when Ozrek finally gave the order to open it, revealed not the weapons cache or smuggled technology his boarding party had expected, but a small, softly lit chamber built around a single sealed containment unit, pulsing gently with the same steady 4.2-second rhythm that had first drawn his sensor officer's attention from orbit. As his boarding party stood in wary, uncertain silence, a voice emerged from the chamber's integrated speaker system, calm, measured, and carrying the particular weariness of someone who had spent far too long alone with unfinished business. "Hello, Raid Commander," the voice said. "My name is Dr. Ria Osai. I understand you have some questions for me, and I promise you I have spent 22 years preparing considerably more thorough answers than you were expecting to find in an empty cargo hold." Ozrek stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the containment unit, at the quiet, patient pulse of whatever remained of a woman who had died by every official record his government maintained, more than 2 decades ago in an accident that had apparently never happened. "You've been conscious," he said slowly, "for 22 years. Conscious is a generous word for what this existence actually is, Commander," Dr. Osai said. "I experienced something considerably more limited than the life I once had, drawn out across long stretches of low-power dormancy that Odalise has carefully managed to preserve my core's functional lifespan. But yes, in the moments I have been active, I have been aware, and I have spent every one of those moments continuing the work I began before Orlia's reach was destroyed, refining and cross-referencing the data my team recovered from the structure beneath our colony, because I understood, even in the final hours before the attack, that whoever ordered our deaths would eventually need to answer for exactly what they were trying so desperately to hide." "What was it?" Ozrek asked, and found, despite himself, that he genuinely wanted to know, some old curiosity surfacing from beneath 11 years of hardened professional distance. "What did you find that was worth 7,000 lives to bury?" There was a pause before Dr. Osai answered, and when she did, her voice carried a weight that made Ozrek understand, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that whatever answer he was about to receive would not simply satisfy his curiosity. It would reshape his understanding of everything he'd spent his career serving. "We found a warning, Commander," she said. "Not a weapon, not a treasure, not the kind of ancient technology every scavenger and black market dealer in this region dreams of stumbling across. A warning left by a civilization considerably older than any currently active in this galaxy, describing in careful, deliberate detail the exact circumstances that led to their own extinction. Circumstances that, I discovered in my final weeks at Orlia's Reach, bore an uncomfortable and specific resemblance to a pattern of resource consolidation, territorial expansion, and systematic suppression of dissenting information that I had already begun documenting within certain factions of my own government's directorate." "You're saying your government saw itself in that warning," Ozrek said slowly, "and decided it was easier to bury the mirror than change what it was reflecting." "I'm saying," Dr. Osai corrected gently, "that I do not know with certainty what my government's directorate believed, or feared, or intended, only that whatever conclusions they drew from my preliminary reports were significant enough to authorize the deaths of an entire research colony rather than risk that information reaching a wider, more impartial audience. I have spent 22 years wanting, more than anything else my remaining existence is still capable of wanting, the chance to find out exactly what they were so afraid of, and to make certain that fear did not simply die quietly with everyone who might have asked the question. Ozrek turned away from the containment unit, pacing the small vault chamber in the restless, agitated manner of a man whose entire professional foundation had just been quietly, methodically undermined by a woman who had been patiently waiting 22 years for exactly this conversation. "My orders," he said finally, "were to intercept and secure any unauthorized freighter traffic through this sector and report significant findings directly to Fleet Command for further instruction. If I report this, if I tell my superiors what's actually in that vault, they will order its destruction within the hour. You understand that?" "I assumed as much," Odalise said quietly, from where she still sat at the freighter's command console, watching him with the particular steady patience of someone who had already spent considerable time imagining every possible outcome of this exact conversation. "Which is why I need you to understand, Commander, that I am not asking you to trust my word alone. I am asking you to trust the possibility that you might actually want to know the truth about who's been giving your remnant its orders, and why." Ozrek was quiet for a long time, the vault's soft, patient pulse the only sound in the chamber. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the hardened certainty it had held when his boarding party first breached the freighter's airlock. "My younger brother served on a remnant patrol cutter called the HFY Tide," he said, the words coming slowly, as though he had not spoken them aloud in a long time and was not entirely certain he wanted to now. "6 years ago, that ship was lost with all hands during what Fleet Command classified as a navigational accident in an uncharted debris field. No wreckage was ever recovered. No formal inquiry was ever opened, because the file was closed within a week, faster than any accident investigation I have ever seen move in L. Even years of service, I asked questions at the time. I was told very clearly that continuing to ask them would not reflect well on my career." He met Odalise's gaze, something old and carefully buried finally surfacing in his expression. "I stopped asking. I told myself it was because there was nothing left to find, not because I was afraid of what I might find if I kept looking. I have spent 6 years telling myself that story, Captain Ferreira, and I find, standing here in front of your vault, that I no longer entirely believe it." "You think your brother's ship found something it wasn't supposed to find," Odalise said quietly. "I don't know what I think," Ozrek admitted. "I only know that I have spent 6 years accepting a closed file I never actually believed, because believing otherwise would have meant admitting that the fleet I serve is capable of exactly the kind of thing you're describing. It is considerably harder to keep believing that, now that you've shown me a version of that story with a name and a date, and a woman still willing to testify to it after 22 years. I need to make a call," he said, "not to Fleet Command, to someone else." The call Ozrek made, routed through encrypted channels his boarding party had no clearance to monitor, connected him with a woman he had served under for 6 years before her promotion to Fleet Liaison. A Karvash officer named Sela Vray, whose reputation for careful, principled skepticism toward directorate leadership had cost her considerable advancement over the years, and who Ozrek had always privately suspected shared certain doubts about the Remnant's true chain of command that neither of them had ever felt entirely safe voicing aloud. "You're telling me," Sela said, once Ozrek had finished relaying the essential shape of what he'd found, her voice carrying the particular controlled tension of someone processing information she had perhaps always feared but never fully allowed herself to expect, "that Aurelia's reach wasn't an accident. I'm telling you what the freighter's captain claims, and what the recovered consciousness aboard that vessel corroborates," Ozrek said. "I have not independently verified the deeper claims about directorate involvement, and I am not asking you to simply accept them on faith. I am asking whether you know anything at all, about a coordinated strike operation in that sector 22 years ago that never appeared in any official record either of us has ever had access to." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Ozrek began to wonder if the connection had failed. And when Sella finally spoke again, her voice had dropped into something quieter, more careful. The voice of someone choosing each word with the particular deliberation of a person who understood exactly how dangerous the wrong words could become. There was a training exercise, she said slowly, in that general sector around that period. Classified well beyond my clearance at the time, though I remember hearing secondhand from an officer who has since died under circumstances I never fully trusted that the exercise involved live-fire coordination against what we were told was an abandoned research outpost. I never questioned it. I had no reason to. Abandoned outposts get used for training exercises constantly. Except this one wasn't abandoned, Ozrek said quietly. There were 7,312 people on it. Sella was silent again, and when she spoke this time, Ozrek heard something in her voice he had never once encountered in 6 years of serving alongside her. A controlled, carefully contained fury that had clearly been waiting patiently for exactly the kind of confirmation he had just handed her. If what you're telling me is true, Ozrek, we need to move very, very carefully. If the Directorate authorized that strike and buried it this completely, they will not hesitate to bury whatever evidence you're currently sitting on, and they will not hesitate to bury you along with it, the moment they suspect you understand what you've actually found. I know, Ozrek said, that's why I'm not calling Fleet Command, that's why I'm calling you. The next several hours unfolded with a tense, careful urgency that Ozrek would later remember as some of the most consequential of his entire career. As Selavray worked quietly through channels she had spent years carefully cultivating specifically for a moment like this one, while Ozrek's own boarding party maintained watch over the Meridian Grace, and Dr. Osai's patient, weary voice continued answering the questions Ozrek found himself, despite every professional instinct telling him otherwise. Unable to stop asking. What happens to you? He asked at one point, standing again before the softly pulsing containment unit, if this evidence actually reaches the conquered of free systems, if your testimony is finally heard. I do not know with complete certainty, Dr. Osai admitted. This preservation technology was experimental even before Orlia's reach was destroyed, and I have spent 22 years pushing it considerably further past its intended operational parameters than its designers ever anticipated. I suspect, though I cannot promise, that once my testimony has been properly recorded and authenticated by impartial investigators, my core will not have much longer to continue functioning regardless of what happens next. You're saying this is your last chance, Ozrek said slowly, not just to be believed, to exist at all. I am saying, Commander, that I made my peace with that eventuality a very long time ago. Somewhere in the early years of this long, strange continuation of an existence, I never asked for but have chosen every single day since to keep fighting to preserve for exactly long enough to finish what I started. Her voice, despite the weight of what she was describing, carried something that Ozrek could only describe as genuine, hard-won peace. I do not need to survive this, Commander. I need only to be believed, and to know that Orlia's reach will finally be remembered as what it actually was, rather than the convenient lie my government has spent 22 years content to let stand in its place. Sella's channel reopened with a priority alert 11 hours after their initial conversation, her voice carrying an urgency that told Ozrek, before she said a single word, that whatever she had discovered had confirmed his worst suspicions rather than dispelled them. I found the authorization order, she said without preamble. Buried 3 layers deep in an archive I only had access to because of a records migration error nobody's bothered to correct in 6 years. Directorate Counselor Thren Voskel personally authorized what the file describes as a containment operation against Orlia's reach sighting, and I am reading this directly unacceptable risk of destabilizing information reaching the general population regarding precursor technology recovery. Ozrek, this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a rogue decision by some overzealous field commander. This came from the very top of our government. Ozrek closed his eyes briefly, some final, stubborn hope he hadn't fully acknowledged holding onto finally giving way beneath the weight of confirmation. What do? We do exactly what that freighter captain apparently planned for us to do from the very beginning, Sella said, and Ozrek thought he heard, underneath the careful control of her voice, something that might have been reluctant, grudging admiration. We get her to the Concord of Free Systems, Ozrek, and we make sure this reaches investigators with enough independent authority that Voskal and whoever else was involved cannot simply bury it a second time. That's treason, Ozrek said quietly, by any definition our government currently recognizes. So is authorizing the murder of 7,312 people to hide an inconvenient discovery, Sella said. I have spent 11 years telling myself that the things I couldn't change weren't my responsibility to fix. I am done telling myself that, Commander, get that ship to the neutral corridor. I will handle the rest from my end, and I will handle whatever consequences follow, because someone in this chain of command has to finally decide that following orders isn't the same thing as doing what's right. The pursuit began 9 hours into the transit, when Vel's sensor board lit up with 3 contacts dropping out of translight directly along the Meridian Grace's projected course, a maneuver precise enough that Ozrek understood immediately it was not coincidence. Whoever had noticed his patrol vessel diverting from its assigned sector, and however they had guessed his destination, they had guessed correctly, and they had not sent a single ship to investigate quietly. They had sent 3 running dark weapons already charged, closing fast. Directorate Internal Security Markings, Vel said, her voice tight with the particular controlled fear of a young officer realizing in real time that the mission she had signed on for had just become considerably more dangerous than intercepting an unarmed freighter. Commander, those aren't Remnant patrol vessels. Those are Voskal's personal security detachment. He knows, Ozrek said, watching the contacts resolve on the display, close enough now to make out their weapons' batteries already rotating toward firing solutions. Sella must have tripped something searching those archives. He's not sending anyone to ask questions. He's sending them to make sure this ship never reaches the corridor. We're 11 hours from the boundary, his second reported. At current speed, they'll be in effective weapons range in under 20 minutes. Ozrek had spent 11 years commanding a vessel built for boarding actions and salvage operations, not for outrun. Ning 3 purpose-built security cutters with fresher engines and considerably more firepower, and he understood, watching the tactical display update in real time, that a straight run for the border was not a plan. It was simply a slower way of losing. Odalese, he said, opening the channel to the Meridian Grace, where the freighter continued its steady, unarmed course toward the corridor under his escort. I need you to tell me this ship has something besides empty cargo holds and a vault. Please tell me Dr. Os I built in more than one contingency. There was a pause, and when Odalese answered, her voice carried the particular grim calm of someone who had, in fact, spent 22 years preparing for exactly this possibility. The Meridian Grace has an experimental signal dampening field, salvaged from precursor-adjacent research Dr. Osai's team recovered before the colony fell. It won't stop weapons fire, Commander, but it will scatter targeting locks within a 200-kilometer radius for approximately 4 minutes once activated, long enough to buy distance if your ship can create an opening for us to use it. 4 minutes, Ozrek repeated, and after that? After that, it needs 11 hours to recharge, which I suspect is considerably longer than we have, Odalese said. So I'd suggest, Commander, that whatever opening you create needs to be the only one we get. Ozrek turned to his second, already running the geometry in his head, the old, familiar calculus of a boarding commander who had spent a career finding the narrow seam in someone else's defenses rather than defending his own. Bring us between the lead cutter and the freighter, full profile exposure. I want their targeting systems looking at us, not at her. Commander, that cutter alone outguns us, all 3 together. All three together only need to worry about us for as long as it takes Captain Ferreira to get her field online, Ozrek said. That's the opening. We don't need to win this fight. We need to survive 4 minutes of it. What followed was not, by any measure Ozrek would later use to describe it, an elegant engagement. His vessel took the first exchange of fire directly across its forward shielding, absorbing a punishing volley that buckled 2 deck plates and knocked Vel out of her chair hard enough to leave her nursing a fractured wrist through the rest of the encounter. And for a long, brutal stretch of seconds that felt considerably longer than they actually were, Ozrek's ship did nothing but endure, weaving just enough to keep the freighter shielded behind its own hull, while 3 Directorate cutters poured fire into shields that had never been designed to withstand this kind of concentrated assault. "Fields charging," Odalys reported, her voice tight but steady over the open channel. 90 seconds. "We don't have 90 seconds, Ozrek II said, watching secondary power readouts flicker across a control board increasingly lit with amber and red warnings. "Then we find 90 seconds, Ozrek said, and hauled the ship into a hard rotational burn that put its most heavily armored quarter between the lead cutter's next volley and the freighter's exposed hull. A maneuver that cost them their aft sensor array entirely but bought, by his second's frantic count, another critical stretch of seconds. "Field active," Odalys called out, and Ozrek felt rather than saw the strange, disorienting shudder that rippled across every targeting display in the immediate area as the Meridian Grace's dampening field scattered every locked weapons solution within 200 kilometers into useless static. The 3 Directorate cutters, suddenly blind, broke formation in the confused, uncertain scramble of pursuit vessels that had lost their prey without warning, and Ozrek used the opening without hesitation, driving his ship hard alongside the freighter and pushing both vessels toward the border at the absolute limit of what their engines could safely sustain, putting critical distance between them and the scattering pursuit force before targeting systems could recalibrate. They crossed into the neutral corridor's outer sensor boundary 11 minutes later, the 3 Directorate cutters falling away behind them, unwilling in the end, to risk an incident inside space jointly monitored by the conquered of free systems, whatever their orders from Voskull might have demanded. "Everyone still breathing?" Ozrek asked, once the immediate danger had passed and the adrenaline of the engagement began slowly to drain out of his voice. "Vel's wrist is broken, but she'll live," his second reported. "Ship's taken significant damage, but nothing that isn't repairable. We made it, Commander." Ozrek allowed himself a long, unsteady breath, watching the border checkpoint's lights finally resolve ahead of them on the display, and understood with the particular clarity that came after surviving something that should not have been survivable, that the 4 minutes he had just spent absorbing fire meant for an unarmed freighter had been, without question, the most consequential decision of his entire career. The formal checkpoint crossing itself once they reached it felt almost anticlimactic after the violence of the preceding hour. The Meridian Grace and Ozrek's battered patrol vessel waved through by conquered of Free Systems border officials who had clearly been briefed in advance. Thanks to the considerable personal risk Celevray had taken arranging safe harbor through contacts within the oversight fleet. Contacts who had, upon hearing even the barest outline of what Ozrek's ship was escorting, agreed to provide immediate protection and formal evidentiary custody, without waiting for the kind of lengthy bureaucratic approval that might otherwise have given Directorate Counselor Thren Voskull a second chance to intervene. Ozrek stood on the Meridian Grace's small bridge beside Odalys as the checkpoint's inner harbor lights washed over both ships, watching the tension in her shoulders finally slowly begin to ease after 22 years of carrying a weight he suspected she had never once, in all that time, allowed herself to fully set down even for a moment. "You planned this entire sequence of events," he said, trusting that whichever remnant vessel happened to intercept you would eventually choose to help you instead of simply reporting you to Fleet Command. I planned for the possibility, Odalys corrected. I could not guarantee it. I spent 4 months studying patrol patterns to maximize the odds of encountering a commander whose service record suggested someone who might still be capable of questioning orders when the situation demanded it. Your record showed exactly that kind of officer, Commander, more than once, in small ways that never rose to formal insubordination, but consistently suggested a man uncomfortable simply following instructions he didn't fully understand. She glanced at him, something almost like gratitude softening her otherwise carefully composed expression. I gambled 22 years of work, and the last remaining chance for my mentor's testimony to ever be heard, on the hope that I had read your record correctly. I am considerably relieved, Commander, that I did. You gambled everything on a stranger's character, Ozrek said. That's not planning, that's faith. Sometimes, Odalys said quietly, faith is simply planning that hasn't finished proving itself right yet. Dr. Osai's testimony, once formally received by Concord of Free Systems investigators 3 days later, triggered an inquiry that would eventually reshape the political landscape of the entire Hollow Expanse region. Though Ozrek understood, standing in the quiet aftermath of that first formal deposition, that the true weight of what had happened had very little to do with politics at all, and everything to do with a woman who had spent 22 years of fractured, dormant, painfully limited existence, refusing to let 7,312 deaths be quietly erased from history. Vel found him on the observation deck the evening after the deposition concluded, her fractured wrist set and sealed in a medical brace, her expression carrying the particular unsettled look of a young officer trying to reconcile the mission she had trained for with the one she had actually just survived. "Can I ask you something, Commander?" she said, and when Ozrek nodded, she continued, choosing her words with visible care. "When we first boarded that freighter, I thought we'd found the easiest salvage of my entire career. An empty ship, no resistance, no cargo to fight over. I keep thinking about how close we came to just logging it as a bust and moving on to the next contact if the captain hadn't been sitting there waiting for us, if she hadn't decided to trust that you'd actually listen." "She didn't decide that by accident," Ozrek said. "She spent 4 months making sure the odds favored her." "I know," Vel said. "That's what I keep thinking about. How much of what just happened only worked because one person was patient enough and brave enough to bet 22 years of her life on the idea that somewhere in a fleet built to take things by force, there might still be an officer willing to give something back instead." She glanced at him, something like new resolve settling into her young face. "I want to be the kind of officer people can afford to bet on, Commander." "I don't think I understood before this what that actually required." Ozrek studied her for a long moment, remembering himself at her age, still years away from the quiet, accumulated doubts that had eventually made this moment possible. "It requires exactly what you did today," he said. "Staying steady when the shooting starts and asking the harder question even when the easier answer would let you sleep better. You did both, Vel, that's not nothing." "How do you feel?" Ozrek asked Dr. Osai, standing once more before the softly pulsing containment unit, in the quiet hours after the formal deposition concluded, and Concord investigators had withdrawn to begin the long, careful work of building a case against Directorate Counselor Thren Voskel, and everyone who had helped him bury the truth for over 2 decades. "Tired," Dr. Osai admitted, and for the first time since Ozrek had first heard her voice, something in it carried a kind of settled, peaceful exhaustion rather than the restless, driven urgency that had clearly kept her functioning, however fractured and limited, for 22 long years. "But it is, I think, a different kind of tired than the one I have carried since Aurelia's reach. It is the tiredness of someone who has finally set down something extraordinarily heavy, rather than someone still bracing to carry it a while longer." "Your core's degradation," Ozrek said carefully. "The investigators mentioned it's accelerating now that the primary data transfer is complete." "Yes," Dr. Osai said without any evident fear in her voice. "I do not have very much longer, Commander, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I am entirely at peace with that. I did not build this strange, extended existence because I wanted to live forever. I built it because I needed enough time to make sure the truth outlived the people who tried to bury it. That work is finished now. I am allowed, I think, to finally rest." Odalise, standing quietly beside Ozrek during this exchange, reached out and placed her palm gently against the containment unit's cool outer casing, a gesture Ozrek suspected she had repeated countless times across 22 years of solitary, exhausting devotion to a woman who had once been her mentor and had, somewhere along the way, become considerably more than that. "Thank you," Odalise said quietly, "for trusting me enough to send me away that day instead of asking me to stay." "You were the better bet, Odalise," Dr. Osai said, and something in her voice, weary and fading now but still unmistakably warm, carried the particular tenderness of someone speaking to a person she had watched grow over decades of shared purpose into precisely the kind of person she had always hoped they might become. "I knew even then that I could not outlive what I'd discovered, not in any body capable of carrying it very far. But I could build something that might, given enough patience, enough courage, and enough time. I simply needed someone brave enough to carry it. I am, and have always been, considerably prouder of that choice than of anything else I accomplished in my entire career." Dr. Ria Osai's preservation core finally, gently ceased functioning 6 days later, in the quiet hours of what the Concord of Free Systems investigators had already begun referring to, with the particular careful formality of people documenting something they understood to be historically significant, as the Orlias reached testimony, a body of evidence that would, over the following months, lead to Councillor Thren Voskuil's formal indictment. A sweeping reform of directorate oversight protocols, and perhaps most remarkably to Ozrek, a quiet but unmistakable shift within certain factions of the Karvash Remnant itself, as officers who had spent years privately harboring doubts about the orders they'd been asked to follow finally found themselves with concrete evidence that those doubts had been justified all along. Célèvre's role in bringing that evidence forward did not go unnoticed by the Directorate loyalists who remained, in the uneasy months that followed, still entrenched in significant portions of the government Voskuil had once helped run. And Ozrek understood, watching her testify alongside Dr. Osai's recorded deposition before a joint Concord and Remnant Reform Tribunal, that she had traded the safety of a comfortable liaison post for a considerably more precarious existence as one of the public faces of an inquiry that powerful people very much wished had never begun. She did not seem to regret the trade. When Ozrek asked her, in the quiet aftermath of her testimony, whether she feared what Voskuil's remaining allies might still attempt against her, she had simply shrugged, the particular weary, unbothered shrug of someone who had already decided, long before this moment, exactly what kind of risk she was willing to accept in exchange for finally telling the truth out loud. "I spent 11 years being careful," she told him. "Careful got 7,312 people killed and their deaths buried under a training exercise report nobody ever bothered to double-check. I find I have very little appetite left for careful, Ozrek. If they come for me because of what I said in that room, at least they'll have to explain in public exactly why the truth frightened them enough to try." The precursor warning itself, once properly translat, ed and cross-referenced by a joint team of Concord, Remnant, and independent xenoarchaeological researchers working from the data Dr. Osai had spent 22 years refining, proved to be considerably more significant than even Ozrek had initially understood standing in that quiet vault chamber listening to her voice for the first time. The civilization that built the structure beneath Orlia's reach had not simply left behind a record of their own extinction. They had left behind, embedded carefully within layers of dormant transit and communication infrastructure scattered across dozens of systems throughout the region, a broader map of every other civilization that had made the same mistakes before them, a patient, ancient catalog of empires that had chosen expansion and suppression over honesty, and had every single time eventually collapsed beneath the weight of exactly the kind of truths they had spent their final centuries trying desperately to bury. "It's not really a warning about us," Odalys said to Ozrek several weeks later as researchers continued combing through the newly accessible fragments of the ancient network. Not us specifically, I mean. I think Dr. Oz, I understood that faster than any of the rest of us. It's a pattern. The same pattern repeating itself across thousands of years and dozens of different species, all of them convinced their particular reasons for silence were different, more justified, more necessary than anyone else's. The structure isn't a weapon or a treasure vault, Commander. It's a mirror, left behind by people who wanted whoever found it next to recognize themselves in it before it was too late to change course. Ozrek considered that, watching the same slow, patient wheel of stars that had accompanied so much of the past several weeks. Do you think the Directorate will actually learn anything from it? Once the tribunal concludes, once the reforms are implemented, once this stops being front-page testimony and starts being history. I don't know, Odalys admitted. Dr. Oz used to say that societies rarely learn from warnings. They learn, if they learn at all, from people. Specific people making specific choices at moments when it would have been considerably easier not to. She looked at him. I think that's why she trusted me to carry her all this way instead of simply broadcasting the data and hoping someone eventually noticed. And I think that's why this worked at all, Commander. Not because the evidence was compelling, though it was. Because you were standing in that vault chamber willing to actually listen to it. Ozrek stood on the Meridian Grace's observation deck in the aftermath, watching Odalys carefully oversee the ceremonial transfer of Dr. Osai's now dormant preservation core into the permanent custody of conquered archivists, who had promised, with a formality that seemed to genuinely comfort Odalys, that the core would be preserved indefinitely as a memorial rather than simply discarded once its evidentiary value had been exhausted. "What will you do now?" he asked her, once the transfer ceremony concluded and the small gathering of investigators, archivists, and quietly interested onlookers had begun to disperse. Odalys considered the question for a long moment, watching the slow, patient wheel of stars beyond the observation deck's viewport. The particular unhurried stillness of someone who had spent 22 years so completely consumed by a single driving purpose that she had perhaps forgotten, somewhere along the way, what it might feel like to simply exist without one. "I honestly don't know," she admitted. "I've spent more than half my life carrying this. I'm not entirely certain who I am without it." She glanced at him, something almost curious in her expression. "What about you, Commander? I imagine returning to the Remnant isn't a particularly safe option anymore, given everything you helped uncover." "No," Ozrek agreed. "Sela tells me there's considerable interest within certain reform-minded factions of the Remnant leadership in officers with demonstrated willingness to question orders that don't survive honest scrutiny. Apparently that's a rarer quality than it should be." He paused, studying the same slow wheel of stars Odalys had been watching. "I find myself, for the first time in 11 years, uncertain what comes next as well." "Perhaps," Odalys said, and something in her voice carried the first genuine warmth Ozrek had heard from her since the boarding party first breached the Meridian Grace's airlock. "That's not the worst place to start from. Uncertain, but finally free to choose, rather than simply following whatever path was already laid out ahead of us." They stood together in silence for a while, the observation deck quiet except for the distant hum of conquered archivists still cataloging the last of the physical evidence recovered from the Meridian Grace's vault. And Ozrek found himself thinking. About the 4 minutes his ship had spent absorbing fire meant for an unarmed freighter. About a signal-dampening field built from technology recovered out of ruins that had cost 7,312 lives to protect. About a 19-year-old research assistant who had grown, across 22 long and lonely years, into a woman capable of gambling everything she had on the possibility that a stranger might still choose to do the right thing when it mattered. "What happens to the ship?" he asked eventually. "The Meridian Grace, once the evidentiary hold is lifted." "I've been offered a position," Odalys said, "helping the Concord's new oversight division develop protocols for identifying exactly this kind of buried historical evidence, in case other colonies, other cover-ups are still waiting somewhere to be found. I think I'm going to take it." I spent 22 years learning how to carry one truth safely across dangerous space. It seems a waste to stop now, when there's apparently no shortage of other truths still waiting for someone patient enough to go looking for them. And the ship itself. Odalise allowed herself something close to a genuine smile, the first Ozrek had seen from her in the weeks since the boarding party first found her waiting, calm and unafraid, at the Meridian Grace's command console. I'm keeping her, Commander. She's earned a rather more interesting second career than hauling cargo she was never actually meant to carry in the first place. Ozrek considered that for a long moment, thinking about 11 years of orders followed without question, about a freighter that had carried no cargo at all except the patient, unbreakable determination of two women, one long dead and one still very much alive, who had refused to let 7,312 lives be quietly erased from history simply because the truth had been inconvenient for the people powerful enough to bury it. No, he agreed finally, watching the stars continue their slow, indifferent wheel beyond the viewport, carrying within their ancient, patient light the memory of a colony, a warning, and a woman whose testimony had finally, after 22 long years, been allowed to reach the people who needed to hear it. I don't think it is. Years later, when officers new to the reformed Remnant fleet asked Ozrek why he had chosen to abandon a stable, respected career to help build an institution still finding its footing, he found himself telling them, more often than not, about an empty cargo hold at the edge of the Hollow Expanse, and about the particular unshakable lesson it had taught him, that the most dangerous cargo any vessel could ever carry was not a weapon, or a fortune, or even a secret. It was simply the truth, patiently kept, waiting only for someone willing enough to finally listen.